Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past.
My name is Mattias Hessérus, and I'm here with Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, and we are going to discuss militant Islamism with a special focus on the Houthis. Elisabeth, what inspired you to study militant Islamism in the first place?
Gosh, this was back in the late 1980s when I was still at school. I noticed from my parents' newspaper that there was an awful lot of trouble going on in the Middle East region. So it was a fairly superficial idea that I had back as a teenager, thinking I'd love to find out more about the roots of the region and why it seems so conflict-ridden today. And so I decided to learn Arabic, and I studied Arabic at university, and then that took me via a circuitous route, first of all through literature and poetry of the Arabic-speaking world. And then after 9/11, I switched focus more to security and militant Islam. So that's how it happened.
Why have you found yourself studying the Yemeni context in particular?
I felt that the Yemeni context was, number one, quite unstudied relative to other parts of the Middle East, and that there weren't very many people on the ground in Yemen, but for security reasons, accessibility. And so I thought that this would be a great space for me to get into. And of course, a lot of the region's troubles and successes both emanate from that corner of the Arabian Peninsula. So I thought, what better way of really getting under the skin of what's going on than just taking myself there and figuring it all out. And of course, Yemen is so many countries all in one. It's not a natural single country. For years, decades, centuries, it was a patchwork of tribal fiefdoms, sultanates, and imamates, kingdoms, all lumped together today as this thing we call Yemen. And so unpacking all of that was just fascinating.
And you also spent quite a lot of time there, traveling in Yemen. And that must have been both, well, security-wise, quite difficult. And how did you do it?
How did I do it? Well, of course, I had to ignore all the advice of the Foreign Office and other loved ones. But I think sometimes you take these risks because you feel you're going to find out more. And it's very hard to write about and really understand a region unless you're there. And so how did I do it? Well, I went in over the eastern border of Yemen from Oman, and I was helping try to promote what local communities and local tribes were aspiring to, so to give them an international voice. And in return, we sort of became friends. We struck up a really strong bonds, and they would protect me. I think those who go into Yemen as journalists, or even indeed as diplomats, have a very different kind of relationship. And journalists, at least, tend to be fairly transactional. You might pay for protection, and that's always a mistake, because paying for protection just means that someone else will pay more, potentially to kidnap you. So I would go in, I would have no money at all. I would never carry money, and it would all be about friendly arrangements. And in fact, when I went over the border for the first time, it was amazing to me that all of these 4x4s were lined up with tribal convoys waiting to receive me. And it was quite startling how well armed this place is. So, for example, the convoys that met me at the border, you could drive for just a couple of kilometers, and then they would go to some ramshackle old gas station, give in chits where they'd had to check in their weapons to go to the border, and then all their weapons would be given back, and then off we went into the hinterland. So it was very exciting.
It's so interesting also that you've focused on poetry early on in your research. So why do militant jihadist groups rely on poetry, literature and songs to spread their message?
Well, I think there are two reasons. One is opportunistic, because this is clearly a very good way of spreading a message that's quite a natural part of everyday life. And of course, so let me just give you a statistic first. When I surveyed 10 different districts in the east of Yemen, I discovered that 74% of all respondents think that poetry is a very important part of their daily lives, either very important or important, out of a list of sort of 6 elements. And so yes, it's opportunistic because you're plugging into a very natural tradition. And then the second reason is that it's incredibly practical, powerful, because when your websites get taken down and your social media feeds are closed, well, the poetry sticks around. It's an oral culture, so it's memorized, and it stays in the collective memory, and it travels, it spreads, so it can jump checkpoints. It kind of travels on the wind. So whatever goes into poetry just hangs around. You can never get rid of it. So for those two reasons.
How would you judge the quality of the poetry?
Well, it varies. Some of it is pretty cheesy and clearly just designed to give a very direct message, sort of kill the infidel. But other elements of the poetry are really very lyrical and beautiful. So I think it depends very much on the poets. There were 2 exceptional Al-Qaeda poets in Yemen, both of them droned around 2015, and they're really sorely missed in the movement. We haven't seen any fabulous poets really emerge since then, although poetry's still all over the movement. They're not quite as gripping, and these 2 guys were very much mourned. I mean, even not that I've been radicalized, but, I kind of missed their poetry. It was so beautiful and incredibly powerful stuff.
Have we in the West tend to overemphasize the importance of ideology in driving jihadist movements?
Possibly. The ideology is important. And, if you're trying to promote a movement, then those who are your target market like to know that the ideology is there. It needs to be well thought through. And so you might have one of their big jihadi magazines and there'll be dozens of pages of ideology. But in my experience, that's quite often skipped over. And the focus tends to be on the softer parts, the softer culture, and the poetry is particularly powerful. And of course, back in 2015, when I was giving a talk on my research into jihadist poetry to an intelligence audience, they were fascinated by this. They said, God, we never realized the poetry was so important. We haven't really been looking at it. And when we get our translations of the material, because not that many people are operating in the primary source language, that's another problem, they would say, we just get a translation of the ideological stuff, and then perhaps there'll be a sentence which says, oh, and then there were 8 verses of poetry, and then there were 12 lines of poetry, but it won't be translated. And that really misses an essential part of how this all works. And let me give you an example. My research was trying to do something different. Instead of asking, who are the terrorists, where are they, and what are they planning? My research asks, what are they feeling? What's the mood? What are they singing about? And what might that tell us about what they're planning? So I have a slightly less direct approach.
Have you come across any attempts to counter the jihadist message by using similar methods, such as songs, poems, or work of literature?
Not really. And nor would that necessarily be helpful. I don't think that it's a good idea to have intelligence services sitting in offices with Google Translate or artificial intelligence trying to churn out poetry, because the whole point is that it needs to plug into an authentic movement. But I tell you what we could do. We could, for example, bring together poems that are naturally written by Yemeni or other Arabic-speaking communities, which very often tackle subjects like tolerance or peace, or, let's say, different alternative ways of governance that are not a caliphate, and perhaps magnify them by trying to help them along in promoting their work. So, I mean, that might be one way of doing it, but I certainly wouldn't advise inventing it.
How has the message being communicated by jihadist groups, how has it changed over time? You mentioned 9/11. So if you look from 9/11 to the present, has it changed over time?
I think the main thing that's changed is the way in which things are communicated. And that means that the communication and the ideologies, the narratives have become far more powerful because they're so instantaneous now. I have an iPhone that's littered with applications. I've got everything, apps from Hoop Messenger to Telegram and everything in between. And they sort of move from app to app. When they get closed down on one, they open on another. And the chats and the flow of information is massive. But I'm not so sure that the core message has changed. They still want the USA and what they would call the Zionists out of the Middle East, out of the lands of Islam, and they would like to rule by Islamic law and preferably with one great big caliphate. So those two sort of core elements haven't changed.
So we've heard a lot about the Houthis. We've seen a lot about it in the news. Can you explain the origins of the Houthis?
The Houthis are often mistaken to be a tribe. They're not a tribe, but Houthi is a family name. And of course, it goes back to the area that they came from originally. And they are run by a family now, but that doesn't mean that they're just a tribe. In fact, the Houthis hail from the northern highlands of Yemen, which are really difficult terrain. So they're quite a hardened core group. And then they managed to agglomerate themselves around not just a religious ideology, but also a sort of cultural apparatus and also military organization. So they're all of those three things at the same time. Now, they are a Zaydi form of Islam in their core, but that doesn't account for all Houthis. And there are certainly lots of people in the Houthi movement today who are not Zaydis, a branch of Shiism, but different from Iran's branch of Shiism. And
in what way is it different?
Well, they have a different idea of succession of the original imams. So, for example, in Iran, they sort of believe in, it's called the Twelver Shiism, whereas the Zaydis would be called Fivers. So, I mean, that's a very sort of cosmetic explanation. But it does matter, and it actually means that Zaydi Islam is probably slightly closer to Sunnism. What's interesting today, however, is that we find them becoming more and more extreme in their religious views. And right now, for example, the leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the younger brother of the guy who founded the Houthi movement, Hussein al-Houthi, who died in 2004, he speaks today as though he's the word of God himself. And they've brought in quite a few of the Iranian types of trappings. For example, they will celebrate the Prophet's birthday. They didn't used to do that. They'll have a lot of green paint around and great big billboards with their slogan, which echoes the Islamic Revolution slogan. It's basically, Allahu Akbar, followed by Al-Maut l'America, Al-Maut l'Israel, death to America, death to Israel, a curse on the Jews and victory to Islam. So it's a pretty militant movement.
Would you say that the Houthis are typical of modern jihadist movements, or in what ways are they unique?
Well, they're unique in that jihadist movements are typically thought of to be militant Sunni movements. And of course, the Houthis are mainly a Shi'i movement. So that does split them off from what we would typically think of as Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Yet, I think they are getting quite close in many ways to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Perhaps this is a different conversation, but typically these would have been arch enemies. And the other difference is that until now, the Houthi movement has not really tried to export its jihad, its war, to Western capitals. So you don't find Houthis recruiting or blowing things up on the streets of Washington, Paris, Brussels, or London. So that's quite different.
Why have the Houthis emerged as a significant player in Yemen's civil war?
Well, their war really began in 2004 as a reaction to what they perceived to be their marginalization, religiously, economically, politically. But they did lay down their weapons briefly for what we called the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012. What happened then was a real failure of the United Nations-led national dialogue to come to an agreement over the most important matters, which were how do we divide power, territory, and resources, leaving the Houthis very much on the outside of that, out in the cold. And they ended up sweeping to power in September of 2014, taking over the capital, and then essentially taking over power to such an extent that in 2015, Saudi Arabia hosted a coalition of, at that time, 9 Arab, Muslim, Sunni countries to oust the Houthis. So that war has been going on ever since. Now, although there was a truce in 2022, that expired later that year, and technically the war is still going on.
What motivates the Houthis, would you say?
Well, the Houthis claimed when they swept to power in 2014 that they were doing so for the people. They rode a popular wave where people on the ground were annoyed about injustice, about corruption, about nepotism, and about an awkward succession plan by the then president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. So they took advantage and claimed to be championing the people against all of these ills and grievances. Of course, today we see them indulging in precisely those kinds of activities themselves. But what they would now claim to be after is more of they have a supremacist ideology where they believe that they are the legitimate rulers of Yemen, and possibly even more expansionist than that. They ideally have said that they'd like to take over the 2 holy shrines of Saudi Arabia and rule more broadly. Now, I don't think we should really be taking that at face value, but what they do want now are 2 things: power and money. And perhaps not that different from other regimes around the world, but that's what they want. And for that reason, they always get deal remorse. And there have been lots of deals that have been attempted with the Houthis, some of them even signed, such as the Stockholm Agreement in 2018. But ultimately, the Houthis always go back on their word, and they always want more money and more power.
Are they well organized?
They are quite well organized. Yes, they have a Supreme Council, they have a Jihad Council, they have organization which cascades right down to the very local level. And you've hit the nail on the head with that question, because one of the big differences between the Houthis and what is internationally referred to as the recognized government of Yemen is that the Houthis are well organized and the internationally recognized government isn't. And the Houthis have strong control over the areas which they rule, and the government doesn't. And the Houthis also control an area of Yemen. It's not massive geographically, but it contains 2/3 of Yemen's population. So it contains about 20 million people. So they've got access to manpower and they're well organized. And for those reasons, they have to be part of a solution ultimately in Yemen, and they can't simply be bombed into oblivion.
So what is life like in the Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen?
It depends who you are. So you won't see Yemeni leaders suffering starvation, whereas you will see a lot of people in villages who are suffering starvation and who find it very difficult to access humanitarian aid, food, clean water. So life is pretty miserable. And we know that the Houthis have used food and aid as a weapon in order to gain more support. But they rule by a combination of fear and consensus, and it is quite difficult to untangle to what extent either of those operate.
Why have Saudi Arabia and the UAE not been able to defeat the Houthis since the Saudi-led invasion in Yemen began in, 2015?
Yes. So that's a good question, and it's a question we should take really seriously. The Houthis are incredibly difficult to defeat. They have evaded defeat. And the reason for that is that they are hardened fighters. They have been on-off at war now for just over 20 years. So think about this. If you are about 25 years old, let's say, and living in Houthi stronghold areas, you won't have known anything other than war. And that's really important, because that accounts, that sort of 25 and under, that's almost 2/3 of the population. So if you haven't known anything other than war, then you're not particularly hankering after peace, because you don't know what that looks like. So war, in other words, has become a way of life. It has also made many leaders, Houthi official leadership, tribal leaders, incredibly rich, because the war economy has been booming, smuggling fuel, smuggling food, smuggling weapons. And so there aren't many motivations amongst that leadership section of society. And there aren't many dreams amongst the youth section of society that make war an impossibility. And think about this also. Over 7 of the last 10 years of the civil war, the Houthis endured tens of thousands of airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition. And it didn't stop them. They became really adept. And even now that those airstrikes have ramped up, first by America and the UK, then by just America, and now also by Israel, that simply feeds into their narratives. That simply makes them look right all along, that they're standing up against an invading Zionist crusader enemy. And the final point here is that the mindset is different. The Houthis are quite tolerant of casualties. They don't mind death and they don't fear death. And they also are highly confident and they genuinely believe that God is on their side. So the war continues.
So what would it take to restore some semblance of peace to Yemen?
Well, I think it would take 3 things. It would take building up a credible opposition to the Houthis. So there is a presidential leadership council, the internationally recognized government, but it's not very competent and it's not very popular. Number two would be aligning regional actors such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Qatar and Iran. Perhaps a bit wishful thinking, but at least most of those actors to be aligned behind a single solution for Yemen. And number three, it would take breaking apart the Houthis' very strong propaganda apparatus, which is incredibly powerful and means that the war perpetuates.
And how could Western policymakers be more effective in how they approach the Houthis?
They could be more joined up and they could have longer-term planning. Let me give you an example. I find it fascinating that the Houthis can still run their own TV channel, their own social media feeds, and they can still put out loads of incredibly powerful videos, poetry, narratives across the media. You know, how is it that we haven't managed to stop that? And number two, unilateral action, such as the kind of actions that are being taken by the United States in its Operation Rough Rider in March, April, ending in May, are unhelpful, because I think that you can only really stand a chance of defeating the Houthis if you have a joined-up plan between regional and international actors that has some kind of end game, some long-term end game in sight beyond just saying, please don't launch missiles at our ships. There has to be a solution domestically for Yemen and not just about what's in it for us.
Elisabeth Kendall, thank you.
You're welcome.